He struck her in front of everyone and thought the silence would protect him. Officer Raymond Voss had spent decades bullying his way through Charleston's justice system, confident no one would ever hold him accountable. But when he slapped Marian Ellison, a quiet black woman standing near the bench, he didn't realize who she was. He saw someone to dismiss. He saw someone beneath him. But when they picked Marian Ellison, they didn't know who they were messing with. They didn't know she was the presiding judge of the Superior Court, a legal mind forged through decades of defending the voiceless. And what came next wasn't just justice. It was a reckoning that exposed an entire system built on silence. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because the story you're about to hear isn't just about one man. It's about all of us. Sunlight filtered through the courtroom blinds, casting long shadows over polished wood and worn shoes. The air was still, but beneath the silence, something had shifted. Because this time, the courtroom didn't belong to those in power. It belonged to the truth, and truth, when spoken by the right voice, doesn't whisper, it roars. He didn't just slap a woman, he struck the system itself, and for once it hit back. The courtroom was packed that morning, buzzing with routine motions and tired attorneys, until one act of arrogance cracked the silence like thunder. Officer Raymond Voss, a decorated but controversial cop with 20 years on the force and a trail of misconduct swept under polished rugs, stood impatiently near the bench. He didn't see her when she entered, didn't recognize the older black woman in the charcoal coat reviewing a docket at the side table. To him, she wasn't robed, so she wasn't relevant. When she didn't answer his impatient barking, he stormed across the room and, in a move so fast and reckless it stunned the air, slapped her across the face. The sound echoed, sharp and brutal. Gasps rose, papers froze mid-shuffle, and yet the woman didn't flinch. Her name was Judge Marian Ellison, and in 4 measured steps she ascended the bench, placed her hands gently on the wood, and looked him dead in the eyes. The shift in the room was instant. The attorneys stood still, the journalists' pens trembled, and the officers in the back suddenly remembered every complaint they'd ever buried. "Did you just strike a judge in her courtroom?" she asked, her voice low, unwavering. Voss stammered. I didn't know. He didn't mean to." But Marian's gaze sliced through the noise. "You didn't know because you didn't care," she said. And just like that, a career built on fear, silence, and institutional cover began to crumble, starting with the one man who thought he was above consequence. For the first time in decades, the courtroom wasn't a place of silence. It became a reckoning. Have you ever witnessed a moment where everything changed in an instant? Not because someone shouted, but because someone finally stood. Pause here, breathe. This isn't just a story about a slap. It's about the beginning of an unraveling, of lies, of power, of the illusion that authority answers to no one. Judge Marian Ellison had not come this far to be invisible, not after 3 decades of clawing her way through a system that rarely made room for women like her. At 63, she walked with the weight of generations behind her, and the steadiness of someone who had seen justice both fail and prevail. Born the daughter of a domestic worker and a longshoreman in Savannah, Marian had grown up knowing that silence could protect, but it could also suffocate. She earned her law degree at a time when few black women were allowed to dream that big, let alone sit in judgment of others. First as a public defender, then as a prosecutor, she had carried the stories of the overlooked into rooms where no one wanted to hear them. And when she was finally sworn in as the first black woman to preside over the Superior Court of Charleston, they smiled for the cameras. But many never saw her. They saw her skin, her age, her stillness, and mistook it for weakness. But behind her quiet eyes lived a fire that had waited years to burn in the right direction. That morning, when Officer Voss raised his hand against her, he didn't just misjudge her authority. He revealed everything the system had allowed him to become. And Marian, With a lifetime of restraint pressed beneath her ribcage, let the silence speak first. Before justice roared, it listened. In the quiet after the slap, in the flickering courtroom light, every breath felt heavier, and as she slowly turned to face him, the question wasn't whether she would respond, it was how, because Marian knew this wasn't about her anymore. It was about every black woman who had ever been dismissed in a courtroom, every elder who had sat through indignity in silence, and every child watching to see if truth still mattered. Can you remember a time when someone stood up, not with volume, but with presence, and changed the entire tone of the room? Marian didn't just occupy her seat on the bench that day. She claimed the full weight of it, and in doing so made it clear. Some names were meant to be remembered not for revenge, but for revolution. Officer Raymond Voss had always known how to walk into a room like he owned it. His uniform fit like armor, his smirk arrived before his voice, and his badge had been his passport through every closed door the system pretended was sealed. He was a legacy officer, third generation, trained not just in law enforcement but in the art of surviving scrutiny. Excessive force? Always misunderstood. Harassment complaints? Conveniently misplaced. And when something did threaten to stick, someone higher up always helped it slide off. That morning, Voss wasn't expecting consequences. He was expecting compliance. When Judge Marian Ellison turned to face him, not as a faceless clerk, but as the presiding judge of the very courtroom he thought he controlled, it was the first time in his career that the floor didn't feel stable beneath him. Her voice, calm and controlled, named his action for what it was, a criminal assault, carried out in plain sight against an officer of the court. His instinct was to bark back, to dominate the space the way he always had, but no one moved to support him. The other officers avoided his eyes. A journalist quietly hit record on their phone. Voss reached for his usual defenses, confusion, denial, indignation, but every excuse unraveled before Marian's unflinching stare. "You didn't know who I was," she said, "but you knew enough to put your hand on me." The words landed like a gavel. His silence screamed louder than any protest could. Pause for a moment. What happens to a man who's built his entire identity on power when the room no longer answers to him? That's what Voss felt in that moment. Not guilt, not shame, but fear. Real fear. The kind that comes when the people you've always counted on to look away finally open their eyes. As Marian placed him under immediate judicial investigation, in front of witnesses, cameras, and a gallery that had seen enough, it was clear. This wouldn't be buried like the rest. The reckoning had a name now, and it had a voice that refused to whisper. What Officer Voss didn't realize was that his slap hadn't just awakened a judge, it had awakened a storm. Within an hour, Judge Marian Ellison had summoned the head of court security, filed a formal incident report, and personally contacted Internal Affairs and the State Department of Justice. But what unfolded next wasn't just procedural. It was surgical. Marian had spent years watching patterns hide in plain sight, complaints that disappeared, body cam footage that mysteriously went missing, prosecutors who struck deals before evidence could breathe. Now, with Voss exposed, she saw an opening wide enough to shine a light into the darkest corners of Charleston's justice system. Joined by Agent Teresa Vaughn from Internal Affairs and DOJ investigator Samuel Rivas, Marian began connecting dots that had long been dismissed as coincidence. 5 complaints from different defendants, all against Voss. 3 cases where the same assistant DA had declined to press charges. 2 surveillance videos. Gone. 1 common denominator. A quiet culture of protection dressed up as procedure. As they pulled sealed files, whispered names began to resurface. Commanders, prosecutors, judges, all part of a quiet machinery that moved just enough to keep itself intact. What if it was never just about one bad officer? What if it was about how many people helped him stay that way? The more Marian read, the colder the courthouse felt. She was no longer looking at a stack of papers. She was staring at a blueprint of decay. This wasn't a crack in the system, it was a design flaw. And this time, the designer had left fingerprints. As Vaughn leaned over with a list of names linked to suppressed complaints, Marian didn't blink. "We go all the way," she said, "not out of anger, but duty. Because some battles aren't won with fire, they're won with files, silence broken, and the relentless will to dig until the truth no longer hides." Do you think systems this deep can be reformed, or do they need to be rebuilt from the ground up? For Marian Ellison, the answer was already clear, and she was just getting started. The threat didn't arrive as a fist or a file. It came folded neatly inside an unmarked envelope. Delivered to Judge Marian Ellison's chambers the next morning, it contained a single photograph. Her 12-year-old nephew, Micah, riding his bike home from school. On the back, printed in jagged, blocky letters, were 4 chilling words: "Stay in your lane." For a moment the breath caught in her chest, not from fear, but from the cold familiarity of the message. She had seen this tactic before, used against whistleblowers, activists, truth-tellers. But this time, it was personal. Someone was reminding her that justice had a price, and they had just set the meter running. Marian locked the doors, called her head of security, and issued orders with the same calm she used in the courtroom. Her nephew was pulled from school. A trusted officer was sent to guard her sister's home, but even as she tightened her family's circle, the tremor had already passed through her spine. That slap had shaken the system, but now the system was trying to shake back. Later that day, reports confirmed that Officer Voss hadn't acted alone. He'd been moved, quietly, from city custody to an off-the-books holding location. No official transfer, no paperwork, just disappeared into the cracks he had long relied on. Then came the visit. A man in a gray suit, no badge, no name, entered Voss's holding cell with a folder full of surveillance. Photos of Marian, of Micah, of quiet moments turned into leverage. "She's making too much noise," the man said. "You know how to remind people to be quiet." It wasn't advice. It was a directive. What kind of justice system allows a judge to be threatened just for doing her job? Pause here. Think about that. For Marian, this was no longer a legal matter. It was war quiet, coordinated, and meant to break her spirit before it broke the truth. But they had underestimated the one thing she still carried: resolve. She didn't back down. She picked up the phone, called the U.S. Marshals, and said the words they hadn't expected to hear. "I want federal protection, and I want Voss in custody by sundown." The rules had changed. Now she was writing them. At precisely 9:00 IMM, Judge Marian Ellison stepped into the main courtroom. Not robed, not presiding, but resolute. The chamber, usually buzzing with routine motions and half-whispered sidebars, fell into silence. Reporters lined the back rows, pens poised. Attorneys stiffened in their seats. Beside Marian stood U.S. Marshal Teresa Vaughn and DOJ agent Samuel Rivas, silent sentinels of a war that had gone public. Across the aisle, Assistant District Attorney Colin Reardon sat tight-lipped, flanked by a representative from the State Judicial Ethics Board, a young man with the stiff demeanor of someone sent to deliver a warning, dressed as procedure. They expected her to plead for fairness, perhaps to retreat under pressure. Instead, Marian delivered a bomb. She formally recused herself from presiding over Voss's case, not out of emotional compromise, but to protect the investigation from being quietly diluted. "I won't allow my courtroom to become a burial ground for truth," she said. Then she unveiled a file, thick with sealed complaints, body cam redactions, and names, prosecutors, officers, even a sitting judge, all tied to systemic suppression. Gasps rippled. Reardon paled. The ethics board rep stuttered. "You're suggesting conspiracy," he warned. "No," Marian replied, voice steady. "I'm proving it." Every word she spoke carved into the granite of denial that had long held Charleston's justice system together. A photo, a transfer, a signature. Piece by piece, she made the invisible undeniable. Then she paused, turned to the press gallery, and let the silence speak for her. "We are not here because of one slap," she said. We are here because of what that slap exposed. A chain of silence wrapped in gold. Have you ever seen a room full of power lose its grip at the sound of one voice refusing to tremble? That's what happened in that courtroom. Not chaos, not rage, just the uncomfortable weight of truth being spoken plainly. By the time Marian stepped down, the damage was done, not to her, but to the structure they thought would protect them. And outside the courthouse a crowd had gathered, not to protest her, but to stand with her. The reckoning had begun, and this time it had witnesses. By midweek, the headlines no longer read, "Judge slapped in court." They read, "System under siege." Officer Raymond Voss had been taken into federal custody without incident, arrested in a downtown parking garage before he could disappear into the shadows with a burner phone and a loaded Glock. But he wasn't the only one in trouble. His silence didn't last. Under the weight of mounting evidence and the whisper of a long prison sentence, Voss began to talk, and what he revealed sent shockwaves across Charleston. 12 names emerged, 7 police officers, 2 assistant district attorneys, 1 retired precinct captain, 1 sitting city councilman, and 1 that left Judge Marian Ellison visibly shaken. Judge Benjamin Halcroft, her mentor, the man who once called her the future of Charleston law. Halcroft, who had sworn her in, who had guided her career with a steady hand and a quiet smile, was now exposed as a central node in the web of collusion. He had signed off on dismissals, buried complaints, and protected officers like Voss with the precision of a man who had done it many times before. The courtroom where the slap had taken place was now the epicenter of a legal earthquake. Indictments were issued, resignations handed in under sealed envelopes, and federal oversight began to grip the local justice system like a vice. Have you ever felt that chill when a trusted name, one you believed in, turns out to be the architect of silence? That was the air in Judge Ellison's chambers when she stared at Halcroft's name, printed in bold at the top of an internal memo. But instead of retreating, she leaned in. Marian understood now that this wasn't just about Voss. It was about the entire machine that allowed him to thrive. And machines don't fall with emotion, they fall with evidence. She didn't cry, she documented. She didn't rage, she strategized. The slap was no longer the story. The unraveling was, and Marian Ellison, betrayed, bruised, but unbroken, was no longer playing defense. She was lighting matches in rooms that had long been dark. 3 weeks later, the federal courthouse was overflowing, not with routine filings or quiet bureaucracy, but with cameras, protest signs, and a city holding its breath. Inside, Judge Marian Ellison sat not on the bench but in the witness chair. The courtroom, the same space where she was once struck and silenced, had transformed into a crucible of accountability. Officer Raymond Voss stood trial, facing 5 felony charges: assault of a federal judge, obstruction of justice, perjury, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to suppress evidence. But the trial wasn't just his, it was Charleston's. Behind the scenes, indictments had already unsealed the rot. ADA Colin Reardon had resigned in disgrace, a plea deal quietly negotiated. Judge Halcroft was under formal investigation. 3 police officers had turned state's witness, their testimonies offering chilling detail on the inner mechanics of institutional cover-ups. The man who had threatened Marian in the shadows, the broker of silence, had vanished without a trace. As the prosecutor called Judge Ellison to the stand, the room quieted into reverent stillness. She walked with the same grace she always had, but now her presence carried something heavier, like stone carved by fire. "What did the moment mean to you, Judge Ellison?" the attorney asked. Marian paused. "It meant that the system I had devoted my life to," she said, voice calm but unshakable, "was no longer capable of protecting those who served it with honesty." She looked toward the jury, not with bitterness but with clarity, and it meant that silence could no longer be the cost of survival. Voss's lawyer tried to rattle her, suggesting personal bias. Marian simply replied, "Bias bends the truth. I brought the truth, and that's what scared them." The jury watched in silence, not just hearing her words but feeling their weight. Pause and ask yourself, How often do we demand bravery from others while settling for silence ourselves? 2 days later, the verdict rang out. Guilty on all counts. But it wasn't just Voss who had fallen. A task force was launched. Over 140 past convictions were reopened. The governor ordered judicial reform, and Marian Ellison, who had once been told to stay in her lane, now paved an entirely new one. For everyone behind her. The rain tapped gently against the courthouse windows as Judge Marian Ellison stood alone in the very courtroom where everything had begun. The bench, polished and silent, reflected her image back at her. A woman who had dismantled a lie with nothing but truth and time. The verdict against Voss had triggered a tidal wave. 147 cases flagged for review, the Charleston Police Department placed under federal oversight, and the formation of a bipartisan reform task force that would rewrite policies once etched in stone. But Marian knew something deeper. This wasn't an end. Justice, real justice, was erosion and rebuilding, not thunder and applause. That afternoon, she stood before the State Judiciary Review Board and delivered her final act, her resignation. Not in defeat, but in defiance of legacy. "I lit the fire," she said. "It is not for me to stand in its glow." They offered her honors, rooms named after her, committees to lead, but she declined them all. "Change doesn't need a monument," she told them. "It needs momentum." Have you ever stepped away from something, not because you lost, but because you had done everything you could and it was time for others to rise? That's what Marian did. 2 months later, she sat on the porch of her family home in Mount Pleasant. The city still buzzed with reform, investigations, politics, but here it was quiet. Her nephew Micah biked home, dropped his backpack and wrapped his arms around her without a word. "You made them listen," he whispered. Marian smiled gently. "I made them look. Listening, that's still up to them." The sunset painted the trees in gold as they sat side by side, no longer afraid, because this wasn't just a courtroom drama. It was a legacy reclaimed, a city transformed, and a reminder that when one woman refuses to bow, the whole house of silence begins to shake. Marian Ellison didn't just fight for herself, she fought for the future. And somewhere, in a courthouse she once rebuilt from within, another young woman now walks the halls not in fear, but in purpose. Sometimes, the smallest moments reveal the deepest truths. One act, a slap, brought years of silence, injustice, and hidden pain to the surface. But it also showed something powerful, that even after decades of being overlooked or underestimated, one person with quiet courage can still change everything. Judge Marian Ellison didn't shout or seek revenge. She stood firm, spoke clearly, and let the truth do its work. Her story reminds us that dignity doesn't come from titles or noise. It comes from how we carry ourselves when no one expects us to rise. And for those of us who've lived through times when speaking up felt dangerous or impossible, her journey is a reminder. It's never too late to be heard. The world may not always listen the first time, but that doesn't mean our voices have lost their strength. Sometimes it takes years for the light to reach the deepest corner, but when it does, it stays. So if you've ever felt invisible, know this. Your presence matters, your story matters, and somewhere, someone is standing a little taller because you once refused to kneel. She didn't need applause to know she'd done the right thing. In the quiet of her porch, with the wind brushing against the trees, and her nephew safe beside her, Judge Marian Ellison found a kind of peace that no courtroom could grant. It wasn't victory she felt, it was survival, the kind that comes from standing firm when the ground shakes beneath you. The city would rebuild, policies would change, cases would be reopened, and names once whispered would be spoken out loud. But more than that, a message had been carved into history. The silence that protects injustice can be broken. By truth, by courage, and sometimes by one woman who refuses to bow. If this story stayed with you, share it, subscribe to Echoes of Racism so these voices don't fade into silence. In the meantime, I've chosen 2 stories I think will move you just as much. Take care, and we'll see you soon.